today's guest speaker, very rarely do we get to have a speaker on the kind of caliber that we have today. Because I would say that in a generation where the media and the masses were calling for God's death and calling for God's resignation, there was a group of godly men and women in this generation that stood up and not only defended the honor of God, but also gave me and you reasons to believe in our faith just besides that's what we've always done. And so, guys, he has participated in over 175 debates on college campuses all across this country. He has authored over 30 books, including Scaling the Secular City, Body and Soul, and his new revised and updated edition, Love Your God with All Your Mind. It is not even released in the bookstores yet, and it's going to be available out at Information Point. I would love for you guys not only to get this and read this for your own personal benefit and your own personal strength, but also just as a way to support the ministry of the guest speaker that we have today. He is a professor emeritus at my alma mater, Talbot Theological Seminary. Everybody, please stand to your feet and help me welcome Dr. J.P. Moreland.
Thank you. Well, that was a wonderful introduction, except for one thing. A professor emeritus is retired. So I'm actually not emeritus yet. I'm still going strong. It's wonderful to be with you. I had the privilege of being at your church a few years ago, and it's exciting to me to see the growth and the excitement for Jesus Christ that's here. Now, I understand that there are people here this morning that may be investigating Christianity, and you're still in the process of thinking about what to make of all this. And I want to welcome you, especially this morning. We're really glad to have you here. Not long ago, the former professor of biology at Cornell University, a man who is known throughout the world for his expertise in biological science, William Provine, made the following statement. Quote, "Let me summarize my views about what modern evolutionary biology tells us. There are no gods. There is no purpose to life. There are no goal-directed forces of any kind. There's no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead. That's the end for me. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics. There's no meaning to life. And there's no such thing as free will." End quote. Now, Provine is a good scientist, but a very bad philosopher. And his view is widely believed among the intellectual elite of our culture. And unfortunately, the culture and what the culture believes is largely determined by the intellectual elites. That's just the way it is. Now, Provine's statement is really not true, because if evolutionary theory is true, it doesn't mean there's not a God. I could grant the truth of evolutionary theory, and I would still have plenty of reasons to believe in God completely outside of the biological realm. There is, for example, an argument for God based upon the origin of the universe. There's an argument for God's existence based on the fine-tuning of the universe. There's an argument for God's existence based on the objectivity of the moral law, based on the miracles in the New Testament and the reliability of the New Testament documents. So even if evolutionary theory is true, it doesn't follow that all the things that Provine has told us are reasonable to believe. As I said, I could grant the truth of evolutionary theory for the sake of argument and still have plenty of reason to believe in the Christian God. Well then, what does evolutionary theory do? It actually does, I think, two things. First of all, it robs us of one argument for God's existence, because we can base an argument for God's existence based upon the design of living things. After all, living things look designed. And so you could build an argument for God based upon the design of living things, and if evolutionary theory is true, it could be argued, that argument is off the table. Fair enough, then evolutionary theory would rob the Christian believer of one out of many arguments for God's existence. That's a legitimate point. The real problem, however, with evolutionary theory is not that it touches on whether or not there's a God. The real problem with evolutionary theory is it tends to undermine some very plausible ways of interpreting the early chapters of the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis is an important foundational document to the Christian community. So it's important to understand that Provine has it wrong. I could grant the truth of evolution, which I do not, but I could grant it for the sake of argument, and all that would do would rob me of one argument for God's existence, and I have plenty of other ones left, and it would rob me of standard ways of interpreting the early chapters of Genesis. So nevertheless, evolutionary theory is an important thing. It's just been misunderstood by the general public and Provine in terms of the impact of the theory if it's true. Now, is evolution true? Well, that depends on what you mean by it. And what I'm going to do in the time we have left is I'm going to characterize three different meanings of evolution and tell you where the tension lies. And we'll see it doesn't lie with where the board seems to indicate it lies. Evolution, the real tension is somewhere else. And then I'll give you three reasons why I don't believe in the theory of evolution. Okay, does that sound reasonable to you? Are we feeling any love? Is there any bonding that's happening, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, very good. All right, what is evolution? Well, it can mean one of three things. First of all, it can mean that organisms change when they go to new environments. Organisms change when they go to new environments. This is true. If you take a group of brown rabbits, and if they migrate to an area where there's a lot of snow, it could be after several generations, their coats turn white rather than brown, and that enables them to survive better. Is that definition of evolution true? Yes, and nobody disputes it. That's called microevolution. The second meaning of evolution is called the thesis of common descent. Now, this is the idea that living things appear on Earth in a sequence of simpler life to more complex life, in a sequence of new life forms, all the way from single-celled organisms, simple life, supposedly, up to human beings. That's called the thesis of common descent. That is what is represented on the board here. We see a sequence of changes from chimpanzees up to human beings. Now, all of the evidence for evolution, so hear me say this. All of the evidence for evolution is evidence for this thesis. There is no evidence for the third thesis I'm about to tell you. So all of the evidence for evolution is evidence for the thesis of common descent. Well, is the thesis of common descent true? I'm inclined to say no, but let me say very clearly that if the thesis of common descent turned out to be true, I would have very little problem with it as an evangelical believer, because I think that the early chapters of Genesis teach us that life appeared on earth by and large through a sequence of events from simple to more complex. So if the thesis of common descent was true, which I don't believe it is, but even if it were, it would cause my Christian faith very little adjustment, because I am committed to the idea, according to Genesis, that living things appeared on earth by and large from simple to complex. I would have to tweak my understanding of Genesis a little bit, but it wouldn't be that big a deal. So, while I do not believe the thesis of common descent, it is not wildly inconsistent with biblical Christianity, and the two can be harmonized fairly easily. The real problem with evolution is the third definition, and that's where all the tension lies. And this is called the blind watchmaker thesis. According to the blind watchmaker theory of evolution, the processes that gave rise to living things are totally naturalistic processes, and there was no room for God to do anything. We don't need to postulate God to explain where life came from. We don't need to postulate that God was involved in this sequence, creating different life forms along the way, because mutation and natural selection, that is, blind processes, the watchmaker who designed us was blind. That means not conscious, not intentional, had no purposes in mind. Why? Because the processes that gave rise to us are purely material, physical processes of mutation and natural selection. That is the blind watchmaker thesis, and that's where the real tension lies, because that thesis says that the common descent of animals from simple to complex took place without any intervention from God creating anything or doing anything during the process. The process is purely naturalistic, and we don't have to postulate a supreme being to explain life. So 3 definitions of evolution: microevolution, no big deal; common descent, a little bit of a problem there, but at the end of the day, that wouldn't be the end of the world if that turned out to be true, though I don't think it is. The real problem is the blind watchmaker thesis, that the natural processes of evolution are adequate to explain everything that we see. Now, there is, in my opinion, not a shred of evidence for this thesis. That's a strong statement. There is no evidence for this thesis. All of the evidence in debates are evidence for common descent, not for the blind watchmaker thesis. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I think it's false. In other words, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I believe that God had to be involved in the process, and that you cannot explain the living world as we know it without there being a creator, intelligent God. Do you understand where we're headed? All right. Now, before I do, there are many lines of evidence I could have selected, but I'm going to pick 3. Let me tell you why I did this. I don't know what your field is, but in most fields, there are pace setters in that field. In the computer industry, there are certain pace setters that set the pace in that field. Does that make sense to you? Now, I am an academic and a professional philosopher, and there are certain people in my discipline that are pace setters. If you're going to be a responsible professional philosopher, you have to read what they write. Because if you don't know what they say, you're not up to speed on your discipline. Does that make sense to you? Now, one of the professional philosophers in my field for 50 years, who's been one of the leading intellectuals in the entire world, I would list him in the top 30 thinkers in the Western world, is Thomas Nagel. He's a professor of philosophy at New York University. He is clearly an avowed atheist. In his book, The Last Word, he makes clear, he says, I fear God. And what I mean by that is, I don't want God to exist. I don't want the universe to be like that. And I hope there's no God. It's called the cosmic authority problem. He doesn't want an authority over his life, and he's clear about that. Well, a week ago, a major event happened. Nagel, who's an atheist, published a book with Oxford University Press. That's not Sugar Creek Bible College Press. Oxford University Press, along with Cambridge University Press, are the 2 top academic presses in the Western world. And he has argued in this book that the general theory of evolution is nonsense for 3 reasons. Now, he doesn't believe in God. He's hoping for another solution. And I wish him well on that. God bless him. But the point is that you have one of the top academic atheists in Europe and the United States publishing a book that just came out a week ago. I've taken 20 pages of notes on this book. I've thoroughly read it. I'm going to use it as a text. I'm reviewing it for an academic journal. And he says that there are 3 things that evolution cannot and will never explain. And so we have to abandon the theory in terms of its adequacy of explaining living things. Are you with me? Am I speaking in a way you can follow me? Okay, let me give you those 3 things that he lists. I'm going to use the ones he lists because he's a critic of our views, and so it's always nice to listen to your critics. First is the origin of life. The origin of life. Nagel claims, and he's right about this, that the probabilities of natural law and chance to produce life is absolutely ridiculous. That you will never get living things by natural laws and Darwinian processes to appear. Now, why is that? Well, you see, when Darwin looked through the microscopes of his day, a living cell looked like a simple little blob of jello. Not so anymore. We now know that the simplest single cell is like the city of Detroit or Chicago or New York. It's got a police department, it's got a library, it's got street signals. I mean, it is as complicated as a city. Do you understand? The problem has become then, how do you get through natural processes and random chance something that complicated in 4 billion years, let's grant? And Nagel says there's not a snowball's chance in a certain place that that's going to happen. And here's an example. Suppose I filled the state of Texas a mile high with quarters, and I put an X on one quarter, and I flew over in a helicopter and put it somewhere in the state of Texas. You with me? The chances of evolving through natural processes a single cell would be the chances of me giving an opportunity to pick one quarter and picking the right quarter on the first draw. No one in his right mind would believe anything like that. What if I did pick the quarter on the first draw? You would know that it was rigged, wouldn't you? That it was done by cheating, it was done on purpose. And Nagel says that there's just not any possibility that the probabilities of forming life through Darwinian processes are so astronomically small that they're comparable to picking the quarter on the first draw in the state of Texas. Nobody in his right mind would believe that. By the way, there's a second problem with the origin of life that I'll mention to you. We now know that information comes from an intelligent mind. When we discover information, it is evidence that intelligence stands behind that information. You've heard of the search for life in outer space, called SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The movie Contact with Jodie Foster was based on that movie. Jodie Foster discovered evidence of life in outer space in that movie because she discovered a signal that contained information. It was the first 20 prime numbers in a row. Now, the assumption that is made by the SETI scientists by the way, I share this assumption, is that information can only come from an intelligent mind. So if we discovered a signal from outer space that contained information, we would conclude that the origin of that signal was an intelligent mind of some kind. Are you with me? Now, what's sauce for the SETI goose is sauce for the DNA gander. And what we have discovered is that there is more information in a single cell than all the books in the libraries where I did my PhD at USC. It is stacked, in UCLA too, by the way. It is stacked with information, and the evidence of information is evidence of mind. So the origin of life is the first reason why Darwinian theory fails, because A, it is too improbable to be rational to believe it happened that way, and B, living things contain information, and information is evidence that the cause is an intelligent thinker. Here's the second reason that I don't believe in Darwinian evolution. It is the diversity of life forms that we see all around us. The diversity and the complexity of life that we see around us. Nagel makes the point that if evolutionary theory were true, and somehow we could get a single-celled organism, say 3.5 billion years ago, There's not enough time in 3.5 billion years to go from a single-celled organism to lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Because if evolution were true, we would not expect there to be enough time for very much diversity to have appeared. Does that make sense to you? In other words, the sheer complexity and diversity of living things is far too much for the mechanisms of evolution to account for it. And Nagel runs a probability argument on this as well, saying, pretty much like the state of Texas, suppose we could evolve a single-celled organism, the probabilities of developing life as we know it are, again, like picking the quarter on the first straw. It's way too improbable. Think of a butterfly, for example. Ladies and gentlemen, the mechanisms that can take you from a caterpillar to a butterfly are staggering. They're staggering. You start with a caterpillar. It goes through a stage where you have a sack of goo, and there doesn't seem to be much information in that sack of goo. And then you get a butterfly squirting out that is totally different than the caterpillar. And the processes and the staggering detail and the amount of complexity involved in something that simple are simply too much for the mechanisms of evolution to explain. Or consider the brain. I'm doing research on the soul and the brain this year. And if you take a look at what are called neural nets, these are networks of neurons which are composed of axons and dendrites, and there's a sodium and a potassium gate and synapses and a presynaptic region and a postsynaptic region, and you're depressed because your regions aren't firing right, and also because you're listening to me this morning. But in order for you to have a thought, this guy's talking too long, you have to have billions of neurons firing in just the right place at just the right time. There's not a chance that that could happen through natural process. It's too complicated, way too complicated. So the probability of life diversifying into the staggering complexity that we see is simply too small for too large for evolution to explain, says Nagel, and I agree with them. One other problem with the diversity of life, oh yes, you must hear about this, involves what is called irreducible complexity. Now, they pay me at the university to use those big words. Irreducible complexity. So let me explain what it means. Something is irreducibly complex if it contains parts that won't work if all the other parts aren't there. So let me give you an example of an irreducibly complex structure, a mousetrap. A mousetrap is composed of 5 parts. It contains the base stem, the spring, the trap, and the thing that holds it down, and so on. You with me? Now, a mousetrap won't work with only 4 of the parts. If you have one of the parts, a stem, the platform rather, 2 parts, 3, 4, nothing works. It doesn't work until you have all 5 parts in the right place, and then it works. That means that a mousetrap is irreducibly complex. What does that mean? It means that if all the parts aren't in place and you just take one part away, the whole thing stops working. You with me? Now, the problem is that you can't evolve irreducibly complex structures one part at a time because it's not going to work until all the parts are there. And how is a structure that's only got some of its parts there and doesn't work going to help an organism survive? Let me illustrate it. There's a little single-celled organism called a flagellum. You can see it in a microscope. Little tiny thing, of course. It has a rotary tail. The thing will turn at 100,000 RPMs in one direction and propel the little guy through a fluid. It'll stop on a dime and turn 100,000 RPMs in the opposite direction, just like that. It contains 50 parts. They've been able to identify all those parts. 50. Guess what? If you've got 49 of the parts, it doesn't work. It needs all 50 parts before any of it will work. How are you going to evolve the rotary tail from precursors that didn't have a rotary tail, one part at a time? So here you have one of its ancestors here that doesn't have the tail, but it evolves one part. That part's not going to do it any good. In fact, it'll probably die out through the processes of competition for survival. It's got to evolve the second part and the third. It's got to have all 50 parts before it's going to help the organism. You can't evolve irreducibly complex structures one part at a time because the structures will not confer survival value on their owners unless all the parts are present. And irreducibly complex structures are a huge, huge problem for Darwinian theory. Now, here are my first two reasons why I'm not a Darwinist or an evolutionist, why I don't believe in the blind watchmaker thesis. One, the origin of life. Too improbable to happen by natural processes. An intelligent designing God overcomes those probabilities because he can intervene and do what he wants. Okay? The second problem with the origin of life is that living things contain information, and we know, as the SETI scientists themselves assume, that if we discover information, that is evidence that the cause of that information was an intelligent mind, so the origin of life. The second reason why I'm not a Darwinist is because the diversity of life is a problem. How so? Number one, the diversity of life is far too complex and intricate for it to have evolved in 3.5 billion years through natural processes and chance mutations in the laws of chemistry and physics. The second problem with the complexity of life is that living systems contain irreducibly complex structures. These are structures where you have to have all the parts in place or it doesn't work. And it will not confer survival value on an organism if it only has a third of a rotary tail or 49/50ths of a rotary tail. And so that is a problem. Now, the third problem for evolutionary theory, and this is the one that Nagel spends 2/3 of the book arguing, and I'm completely with him on this, because I had actually, before I saw this book, published 2 books of my own on the same point, arguing that this is a problem for evolutionary theory, and it's nice to see Nagel agreeing. He may have read my book, I don't know, because I criticize him in one of them, and so he may very well have read it. But I'm sure that he's been thinking about this himself, so we have an independent witness. And here's the problem. In a nutshell, it's consciousness. Consciousness. The real problem is that you can't get mind from matter. Now, if you say in the beginning were the particles, then what you end up with is brute subatomic particles, electrons, strings, protons, neutrons, whatever they think is down there. You end up with particles that aren't conscious. Does that make sense? An electron doesn't have consciousness. Are we comfortable with that? Okay. Now, the laws of chemistry and physics cause these particles to bind together to form molecules. Those bind together to form cells, and those bind together to form the bodies of living things. Are you with me? The process is a process of taking matter and simply forming it into more complicated arrangements of matter. But now there's a problem here, and Nagel points it out. If you start with matter, and all you do is rearrange matter, you know what you're going to end up with? Rearrange matter. You're not going to get mind squirting into existence. To put the point differently, you might end up with brains, but you're not going to end up with minds. And that's because if you end up with minds, that's getting something from nothing. And that's a pretty tough sell. Now, by consciousness, basically what I mean by consciousness is what animals and we have, and that's what we're aware of when we introspect. When you close your eyes and introspect, you're aware of your consciousness. And your consciousness includes, don't try to write this down, but just I'll list it. Sensations, like experiences of pain and pleasure. Thoughts, like the thought that 2 and 2 is 4. Beliefs, like my belief that George Washington was the first president of the United States. Desires, my desire to be a good dad and to have ice cream and to avoid the dentist, which is a conflict of desires, by the way. And acts of free will, where I freely choose to raise my arm to vote, for example. And I hope you'll all vote this election, by the way. So what we have is consciousness is not physical. It's disgustingly invisible. I could look all throughout your brain and I couldn't see your thoughts or your feelings or your desires or your beliefs. All I would find would be neurons firing. Now, the problem is, as Nagel points out, if you say in the beginning were the particles and you rearrange the particles according to the laws of chemistry and physics, you're never going to get consciousness. Now, see, I don't have that problem because I believe in God. I don't think in the beginning were the particles. I think in the beginning was the Logos. So I start with mind. I don't start with matter. And it's not a problem to explain where our minds came from because the universe began with a grand mind. Surely a grand mind could make subsequent minds. Now, there are 3 reasons then that I don't believe the blind watchmaker thesis. Remember, microevolution is true. The thesis of common descent, I think there are problems with it. But even if we granted it for the sake of argument, it might require some minor adjustments in our understanding of the early chapters of Genesis, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. The real problem is the claim, the blind watchmaker thesis, that living things can be completely explained adequately by the natural processes alone. And that's not true for at least 3 reasons. There are others, but I've listed 3 this morning. The origin of life, too improbable, has information that signals mind. The diversity of life, too complex, so it's improbable, and it has irreducibly complex structures. And you have the origin of consciousness from matter, which is getting something out of nothing. And it's more reasonable to think that the universe began with consciousness than that it developed later out of matter. And if it began with consciousness, my view is that means there was a kind of a big mind out there, a big conscious being. Again, if you don't mind, I'll just use the word God for him. And so that's the problem. Now, I want to close with one more point. I think I have just a few minutes left, and then I'll make a recommendation. If Nagel and I are right about this, why are all the scientists Darwinists? Why did he go to UCLA and USC and they're all Darwinists? There are 2 reasons. The first one is that they're taught to think that way in graduate school. They are taught, they're internalized into a theory that you have got to force the evidence to fit. They are not open to alternative methods of explanation because if you start appealing to a designer, they claim that you've stopped doing science, and so they're angry at intelligent design advocates. I was at UC Berkeley lecturing a couple of years ago, and just before I came, William Dembski was on campus defending intelligent design. Do you know what happened? The biology department boycotted the meeting and wouldn't let their graduate students attend it. Boy, there's free thought for you. If this guy's so stupid and his ideas are so ignorant, go to the meeting and expose him as a fraud. But why boycott a meeting? Well, because when you do an undergraduate and graduate degree in science, you are taught a certain set of theories that you're not allowed to question, because if you question Darwinism, you're now going to religion, and religion and science are not supposed to mix. So the first reason that Darwinism is held widely is not because of the evidence. Now, I'm talking about the blind watchmaker thesis now. There is some evidence for common descent, though, like I said, I don't agree with it, but there's evidence for that, but not for the blind watchmaker. So why is the blind watchmaker thesis held? Because that's the sociology of the way scientists are indoctrinated into their community, and it is a community that's very angry and hostile to alternative opinions on this question. You don't believe me? You go to a science meeting and mention that you're an intelligent design advocate, and it's like teeing off a golf ball in the shower. It'll come right back at you pretty quickly. Okay, here's the second reason. The cosmic authority problem. Nagel says, I don't want God to exist. And I think he doesn't say this, so I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think, frankly, the reason Darwinism is held widely is because of sex. In the early days of Darwinism, Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog and defended his views, stated clearly that the reason that he defended Darwinism is he wanted to do sex any way he wanted to, any time, and he didn't want anybody telling him what he should do. And today we are a sex-crazed culture in the West, and I think evolution gives you the permission not to have to worry about a divine being who might judge your sexual behavior. I think that's got a lot to do with it. What it doesn't have to do with is the evidence. Because I'm telling you that while there may be evidence for microevolution, fine. There may be evidence for common descent, fine, though I don't accept that. There is, to my knowledge, a terribly inadequate defense of the blind watchmaker thesis, and there are good reasons not to believe it. Couple of closing remarks, and then we'll pray. First, in my book, Love Your God with All Your Mind, which just came out in a completely revised, expanded version, I have a whole chapter on what I've shared with you this morning, if you'd like to read more about it and have something to hand out to somebody. It's not in the bookstores yet, but there's some copies outside. Secondly, don't let anybody bully you. I meet Christians all the time who think all the smart people are on the other side. That's not true. And if you don't know how to defend your faith, that's okay. We got people to do. And we're a community. We don't all have to know how. You understand what I'm saying to you? Because we have different roles to play. But we have people in our community that are as smart as the people on the other side, and we know what we're talking about. And you don't need to let anybody bully you, because what the Scriptures teach at the end of the day makes sense and they're reasonable, and we have nothing to be ashamed of in believing in the Creator God that we believe in. Now, I'm going to close with a prayer, and it occurs to me that there may be people here this morning who have never made a decision to come to believe in Jesus for the first time. And I'm going to give you an opportunity this morning to do that. And so if you're here and you're an atheist, would you mind bowing your head and closing your eyes out of respect for everybody else? So I'm going to ask everybody to close your eyes and bow your heads if you don't mind, just out of respect. And I'm going to pray a prayer that I prayed when I first came to know Jesus as my Savior. And here's the prayer. Jesus, I'm not sure you're real, but I think you might be. If you're real, would you forgive me for what I've done wrong? Would you come into my heart right now and make me the kind of person you want me to be? In Jesus' name, amen.